There are going to be disagreements. There are going to be, what I call debates. There are going to be some ferocious arguments along the way. So having arguments and having differing points of view is okay, as long as you can work through them and get to a common place of understanding about how you're going to move forward.
Welcome to Founded and Funded. I'm Madrona Digital Editor Garnick Ducken. How to structure a startup board is something first-time founders often don't know how to tackle. When a company is just getting started, adding that layer of governance and oversight, founders in their early team are innovating and moving quickly. But at a certain point, having a great board becomes a huge asset, as long as that board is thoughtfully put together. Boards are truly part of the development and growth of a startup. Unfortunately, the flip side of that is that a dysfunctional board, or one that is not aligned with the founder's goals, can destroy a company faster than a bad product or poor management. That's what we all saw play out with OpenAI. So we thought we'd dig into what good corporate governance and board structure should look like. So here with me today is our Managing Director, Soma, and our General Counsel, Joanna. Soma, of course, has been and is on many boards, and throughout her career, Joanna has advised many startups at different stages of governance. So welcome, Soma and Joanna.
Hi, Coral. Glad to be here.
Hi, Coral. Great to be here.
Basically, what we're trying to do here is set the stage before we dive into all the advice and board structure and governance and everything that we're going to talk about here. So to kind of kick it off for us, Joanna, can you give us the quick and dirty with the problems surrounding the board structure that we saw at OpenAI not that long ago?
I think what's interesting about OpenAI is that OpenAI is really a nonprofit, and the nonprofit owns a for-profit subsidiary. And so that for-profit subsidiary is fully controlled by the OpenAI nonprofit. Most people don't realize that a nonprofit board is very different from a for-profit board. The main important way is that we all understand that a for-profit board tries to maximize shareholder interests. However, in a nonprofit board, they are guided by a stated mission. So that's a very different output. The nonprofit board does have the same duty of care and duty of loyalty, but they have this separate duty that's not found in a for-profit organization, which is a duty of obedience. And so they have an obedience to the laws and the purposes of the organization.
Before I go with you guys to sort of unpack a lot of that and then apply that to sort of startups and founders more broadly, why don't we just define the term governance a little bit? I know that in a lot of the media reports and other things that we've all been hearing and reading, it's gotten thrown around a lot, and I don't know that people fully understand what that means. Okay, governance, yeah, okay, we all get it, but I don't think a lot of people don't.
Governance from a legal standpoint really refers to how an organization is managed or governed. So by who and how. So for most entities, governance starts with their governing documents. These are sort of the foundational rules for an entity. They're typically a charter and the bylaws. The charter is where you will find the rules by which everyone must sort of follow when it comes to governing the company. Now, the charter is typically what sets up a board of directors or whoever is going to manage and govern that organization. They have the ultimate management authority over the organization. And then the authority of the leadership team, say the officers and the CEO, specifically derive from the authority of the board.
So then, Soma, if we pivot to you a little bit, you're obviously the guy with all of the board experience here. And I've heard you say before that basically a board is half company building and half governance, especially in the early stages. So why don't you break down for us kind of the purpose of the board and the experiences that you've had in some of these early stage board building?
In general, I think a board is all about how do you provide the right level of checks and balances, okay, to ensure that an organization is being run or managed, in the most appropriate way. You follow the laws, you ensure that the right things are happening. You also keep in mind the fiduciary responsibility that the board has in terms of putting the shareholders' interests and being aligned with that. As much as I say that, governance is important right from day one kind of thing, usually what happens is like in a very early stage company, the responsibility of the board is twofold. One is it focuses on ensuring that the right governance, is in place, but it's also sort of, a trusted partner to the CEO and the founding team and help with the what I call the company building, whether it's building the team, whether it's helping with product building or product strategy or go to market plans or go to market strategy. There is a bunch of things that need to happen in early stage companies where everybody is learning as they go along, and it's the board's responsibility to be a trusted advisor and a trusted partner to the founding team and to the CEO. So I think about hey, early days, it's actually I could even say it's probably more time being spent on company building, and as the company scales, as the business scales, then more of the governance comes into existence. By the time a company reaches a level of scale and becomes a public company, then the board is predominantly now about governance and about what I call strategic alignment.
You made a good point there. Obviously startups, they have different stages. They're growing is basically the purpose there. And along with that, the board needs to grow along with it and to make sure all of the missions and everything are aligning, which obviously is where we got into a little bit of trouble with the OpenAI stuff. So why don't we talk through the board at those different stages? We've got a board at a seed stage, and when you bring in those outside independent board members and that sort of thing. And I think both of you can tackle that a little bit. But Joanna, why don't you start with sort of the setting that stage and then kind of how things evolve as more funding comes in?
Yeah, I mean, I do think like exactly what Somo is saying, although the ultimate role of the board is oversight, that oversight changes over time. Just like when you're a parent, that your parenting duty over a toddler is very different than your parenting duty over, say, a teenager or even an adult child. And so I think very much seeing that at the end of the day, the board's role is oversight. They oversee strategy, they monitor risks. So when you start at a startup, you might have a sole director on the board. Like when you don't even have any investors, you are literally having a board of maybe one, maybe two, maybe both of the founders, if there's two founders, would be on the board. So at this stage, it's literally the founder's company, and the board directors and officers are often exactly the same people. Once you raise some money at this point, it's often comprised of 3 people is very common. One is the CEO. One would be, say, what we'd call the preferred director, which is usually the representative from the lead investor at that seed stage. And then a third really depends. It kind of could be an independent member. It could be another founder. It could be another investor representative. So something to note here, Coral, and I think most people know this, but since decisions are made on a majority basis, for the most part, it is good practice to have an odd number of board members. Having 5 members at this stage is a bit unwieldy, so we usually don't go quite to 5. As a company raises more and more money and more investors, such investors may ask for a board seat. We might want to change the composition as the tasks change. And so the number of board members you will have might increase, but we usually keep it odd numbered and balanced.
And Soma, what should founders and CEOs kind of keep a lookout for? Any sort of markers or, moments that, okay, maybe it's time to sort of reevaluate what the board looks like. Do we need independent directors? Are there sort of moments that you look for specifically when it might be time for some of that?
I think it's twofold, Coral. Like always, it's a balance. You don't want a 9-member board for a company that has got 2 employees. You also don't want to have 1,000 people in a company and 2 members on the board. But having said that, focus initially on getting people on the board that are really, really aligned with you, both from a strategic perspective and from a creating value perspective. The reason the firm which leads their seed round of financing wants a board seat is they know they put their money where their mouth is, so to speak, and they are responsible. They have fiduciary responsibilities to their LPs, and they want to make sure that they have the right level of oversight and governance and visibility into ensuring that all the right things happen. All right. So every sort of founder has to think about hey, which venture capital firm I'm taking money from, and which partner is going to be on my board. And is that partner somebody that I'm excited to work with? Because there is a meeting of the minds, so to speak. Okay. The closest story I can tell you, Coral, is the following. Okay. If you're sitting in Seattle, let's say, right, and let's say you're the board member and you have a CEO that wants to take a road trip to San Diego. Okay. Both of you need to be aligned that you want to go from Seattle to San Diego. Then you can argue hey, should I take I-5 South? Should I take 101? Should I take some other road? Kind of thing, right? But let's say, the CEO wants to go to San Diego and the board member wants to go on I-90 East, you got a problem. Okay.
So how do you navigate that? So, obviously you do your best to pick those people that are aligned with you and those best partners. But at some point, if you get into a place where you're not aligned anymore, obviously like we saw in OpenAI, what's the actual route that should be taken to handle that sort of conflict?
That's why it is important for you to know who you're going to be working with. And you know that hey, this is a person I'm ready to work with, because it's not like, you're always going to be in agreement. There are going to be disagreements. There are going to be, what I call debates. There are going to be some ferocious arguments along the way, right? But as long as you know that you are aligned on doing the right things and people have different perspectives and different points of view, then I think you can work it out. Sometimes a board and a CEO might say that hey, this is one thing where we disagree, but we have enough trust in the other person that we are going to disagree and commit.
Right.
That I think, is a good way to solve things. Sometimes because hey, it's not like, everybody is going to say yes to everything all the time. That's not what a board is all about. And that's not what a CEO should be expecting. And if a board expects a CEO to behave that way, then probably they're not the right CEO in the first place anyway, right? So having arguments and having differing points of view is okay, as long as you can work through them and get to a common place of understanding about how you're going to move forward. But if you realize that hey, particularly the relationship is so strained for whatever reason and you can't navigate through it, then some change needs to happen.
Is there a process by which that change has to happen, whether in terms of what the rules are that have been put in place, Joanna, or otherwise?
So there are usually rules in the charter and the bylaws that talk about how you would remove a board member, or you would add a board member, or you would switch out the board members. But, again, all of those rules, like almost all legal documents, are there just to be a fail-safe for what to do if you have to figure out what to do. Ultimately, it's about the relationship. Like Soma's saying, you have to work things through. A very functional board, I think, reflects a very functional culture. And the startup ultimately does best when there's a functional board that knows how to work with its management. And so ultimately, it involves both sides, figuring that out. Things that I have seen in my past where it hasn't worked out great is when the CEO or the management don't want to bring things to the board. They don't think the board will understand. They don't think the board will consider it. And I think oftentimes that can cause some issues when the board does find out. And so I think it's really helpful for the founders and the board to have a good, trusting relationship, and vice versa. The board having honest, open conversations with the leadership and the management really go a long way towards having good governance and not having sudden decisions that come out of nowhere and surprise either the leadership or the board. Right.
I think the thing I would add to that is it's a two-way street.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. As much as you could argue that, the CEO reports into the board, the CEO and the board should really think of themselves as like sort of partners, right? And partnership works when both sides operate with the same level of what I call integrity, transparency, communication, and willingness to work together, right? The other thing is as a CEO, sometimes you have good news to share, you have bad news to share, you have lousy news to share, okay, with the board. And rather than trying to be super nuanced about it, ensure that communication happens as real time as possible. Whether it's good or bad doesn't matter. Because if you want to build a trusted partnership, it's really important that you communicate as and when something happens that you think the board needs to know. But things that you think ought to be shared with the board, don't have a different velocity for good news versus bad news. In some sense, I would say the velocity for bad news should be higher than the velocity for good news.
Never wait to tell any news.
Yeah.
Just keep it open and transparent, all lines of communication always. Well, I think that this will be really helpful for people, thinking about starting a company or those sitting in companies right now. And I thank you both so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Coral.
Absolutely, Coral. Thanks for doing this. And I think we this year has been sort of particularly interesting, what happened with like FTX and what happened with OpenAI recently, and all these conversations about like, hey, how do we ensure that the right governance is in place until we realize it's too late, kind of thing, right? And so
Right.
that's, I think a good reminder for every founder and every CEO, no matter whether they are day one or they are like, looking to go public tomorrow, or they're a 100-year-old company, kind of thing, right? Governance and oversight is really, really important. Have the right level of energy and focus and attention on that. Don't go overboard, or don't like under invest in that.
Perfect. Thank you guys both so much.